My name is Matilda. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life I've been known for being steady. That's the word people use. Dependable. Quiet. The kind of person who listens more than she speaks, who notices details but doesn't insist on being noticed in return. I work in a role that rewards consistency rather than visibility. I don't take up much space. I've never needed to. If you ask people who know me casually to describe me, they might say I'm nice, or private, or a bit reserved. Some might struggle to say much more than that, and for a long time I thought that was fine. I thought invisibility was a form of peace. This story isn't about anger. It isn't about revenge. And it isn't about proving anyone wrong in some dramatic, cinematic way. It's about understanding. About the slow, uncomfortable realization that something foundational in your life doesn't quite add up, and that the truth you've been circling has been quietly present all along. I'm telling this story now because it took me years to understand what it meant. Not just the facts of it, but the emotional geometry, the way small omissions can shape an entire sense of self, the way silence can feel like protection, until one day it feels like a locked door. I discovered why my parents never let me see old photos. But what I uncovered wasn't a shocking secret in the way stories usually promise. There were no villains twirling their mustaches, no explosive confrontations, just a series of choices, some made out of fear, some out of convenience, that quietly defined who I was allowed to be. For most of my life, I accepted what I was given. I didn't ask many questions. When certain topics were gently redirected, I followed along. When photo albums never appeared at family gatherings, I told myself it didn't matter. I had a present. Why obsess over the past? But the truth has a way of pressing against you when you're finally still enough to feel it. This story moves slowly, because that's how it happened. It's about being underestimated. Not maliciously, not loudly, but persistently. It's about realizing that what you thought was protection may also have been control. And it's about what happens when you stop reacting and start observing. There's no revenge arc here, no public reckoning. What unfolds is quieter than that, more unsettling in some ways. Because the real shift didn't happen when I confronted anyone. It happened when I understood myself differently. If you're expecting drama, this may not be the story you're looking for. But if you've ever felt that parts of your own history were oddly out of reach, kept just beyond your fingertips, then you may recognize something familiar in what I'm about to share. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without expectation. Have you ever sensed that an important truth in your life was hidden not because it was dangerous, but because it was inconvenient? For a long time, I believed I understood my place in my family. I was the easy one. The child who didn't demand explanations, who adapted quickly, who learned early that harmony was maintained by not pressing too hard on certain edges. My parents used to say I was mature for my age. It was meant as a compliment. It usually is. What it really meant was that I didn't complicate things. I didn't cry for long. I didn't ask why very often. If something was unavailable, an answer, a story, a photo, I accepted the explanation given, or the absence of one, and moved on. At family gatherings, I was the one sent to help in the kitchen. Not because I was forced, but because I noticed when things needed doing. I carried plates, refilled glasses, and listened while others talked. I absorbed details, tone shifts, half-finished sentences, the way my mother's smile tightened when certain years were mentioned, the way my father cleared his throat and changed the subject. People didn't think of me as quiet because I had nothing to say. They thought of me as quiet because I never made them uncomfortable. I wasn't invisible in a dramatic way. No one ignored me outright. I was praised, even, trusted, relied upon, but always in a way that suggested I would not ask for more, that I would not insist on occupying the center of any story, especially my own. When I was younger, I noticed something odd, but only as a vague absence. Other families had photo albums that appeared during holidays or on idle afternoons. Thick books with plastic sleeves, corners worn soft from handling. Stories are attached to each image. I saw those albums at friends' houses, at classmates' birthday parties, spread open on coffee tables like evidence of continuity. In our house, photos existed, but selectively. A few framed ones on shelves, recent ones, school portraits, a graduation photo, a holiday snapshot or two, but nothing from before a certain point. Nothing from when I was very small. When I asked, casually, my mother would say, "Oh, we moved around so much back then." Or, "Those are packed away somewhere." Sometimes she'd add, "Photos weren't as important to us as they are to other people." It sounded reasonable. I accepted it. My father would smile, ruffle my hair, and say, "You're here now. That's what matters." And that felt true enough to stop the question from forming fully. I learned quickly which curiosities were welcomed and which gently dissolved the room's air. I learned that some topics made people tired, or nostalgic in a way that felt heavy. So I adjusted. I redirected myself. I focused on what was present. At school, teachers described me as self-directed. Friends described me as low maintenance. I took pride in that. There's a quiet satisfaction in being the person no one worries about. But even then, there was a subtle sensation I couldn't name. A feeling like being slightly out of frame. As if the camera had been angled just enough that I was always present, but never centered. When relatives visited, they told stories about my parents' youth. About places they lived, people they knew. I listened closely, filing details away. Occasionally, someone would start a sentence about when Matilda was little, and then trail off, correcting themselves, or skipping ahead a few years. No one seemed to notice. Or if they did, they didn't comment. I didn't comment either. This wasn't neglect. It was something quieter. A kind of editorial decision made so early and so consistently that it felt natural. Like punctuation, you don't question while reading. I was loved. I don't doubt that. But love can coexist with omission, with careful framing, with the belief, spoken or not, that some truths are better left unstated, especially when the person most affected appears content without them. And I did appear content. I played my role well. Reliable. Agreeable. Unthreatening. The child who grew into the adult who would never accuse, never demand, never pull at threads that others preferred to leave neatly tucked away. At least, that's who they thought I was. Because what no one noticed, what I barely noticed myself at the time, was that invisibility doesn't erase curiosity. It just teaches it to wait. And I was very good at waiting. The first moment I remember clearly wasn't dramatic. That's what made it linger. I was 8, maybe 9. Old enough to notice patterns, young enough to believe they must mean something. We were at my aunt's house for a late summer lunch, the kind where adults linger at the table long after the plates are cleared. I'd been sent upstairs to fetch something. Napkins, I think. And while opening a hallway cupboard, I saw it. A shoebox. It wasn't hidden carefully, just placed on the top shelf, pushed back, as if no one expected it to be touched. The lid was slightly open. Inside, I saw the corner of a photograph. I remember my heart quickening in a way that surprised me. It wasn't excitement exactly. It was recognition, as if I'd stumbled upon something that already belonged to me, even though I'd never seen it before. I pulled the box down. Inside were loose photographs. Not many, maybe a dozen. Some curled at the edges, some faded. And there, near the top, was a picture of a small child with dark hair and a familiar shape to her face. Me, much younger, sitting on the floor in a room I didn't recognize. For a moment, everything felt very still. I was holding proof. Proof that the years I couldn't see had existed after all. I didn't get to look for long. My aunt appeared in the doorway, mid-sentence, then stopped. Her expression shifted, not to anger, but to something tighter. Something practiced. "Oh," she said lightly. That's just old stuff. She took the box from my hands with a casual efficiency that made it feel like I'd done something clumsy rather than curious. She put it back on the shelf, higher this time, and closed the cupboard. You can go back downstairs now, she added, already turning away. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, my hands empty, my question unasked. No one mentioned it again. At lunch, my aunt laughed. My parents talked. The afternoon unfolded as if nothing had happened. And maybe, to them, nothing had. But something had shifted for me. It wasn't anger I felt. It was a small, precise confusion, like a hairline crack in glass. I replayed the moment again and again. The way the box was taken was not explained. The way the subject was closed without being opened. I didn't tell my parents what I'd seen. I didn't know how to frame it. I didn't want to sound accusatory. And more than that, I sensed even then that telling would make something fragile. So I did what I always did. I stored it. Over the years, there were other moments like that. Tiny. Almost forgettable to anyone else. A neighbor once mentioned babysitting me before everything changed, then laughed awkwardly and said she must be misremembering. A cousin started to ask me if I remembered that place, then stopped and said, "Never mind, you were too young." Each time the adult smoothed the air. Each time the conversation moved on. Each time I told myself I was reading too much into it. That's how normalization begins, not with a lie, but with a pattern of gentle corrections. A shared agreement that curiosity is impolite. I learned not to press, not because I was afraid, but because I was trained. Because every small attempt to reach backward met the same response: deflection, minimization, warmth that asked for compliance. The first small cut wasn't cruel. It was dismissed. And dismissals are easy to forgive when they arrive wrapped in calm voices and reasonable smiles. By the time I was a teenager, I no longer asked about the missing years. I didn't even think of them as missing. Just irrelevant. Something that other people had, but I didn't need. But the body remembers what the mind is taught to overlook. That shoebox stayed with me. Not the images, I barely saw them, but the feeling. The sudden awareness that there were parts of my own story I was not meant to hold. And once you sense that, truly sense it, something changes. You begin to listen differently. You begin to notice what is not said. You begin to understand that silence, when repeated often enough, becomes a message. And that message, however softly delivered, was clear. This is not yours to see. By the time I reached my late teens, the absence of answers had settled into something familiar. Not comfortable, just familiar. Like living in a house where one room is always locked, and after a while, you stop trying the door. I learned how to edit myself before questions fully formed. If a thought drifted too close to the past, I redirected it. I told myself it didn't matter, that everyone had things they didn't know about their childhood. That memory was unreliable anyway. This is how normalization works. You don't accept disrespect all at once. You accept it in pieces so small they don't register as harm. At university, conversations about family histories came up often. People swapped stories late at night, laughing over strange traditions or painful moments. I listened. When it was my turn, I offered generalities. We moved. My parents worked a lot. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that invited follow-up. And no one pressed. I told myself that was proof there was nothing to press for. But there were moments, small, almost silly ones, when the gap revealed itself again. I remember filling out a medical form once, which asked to list any early childhood illnesses or hospitalizations. I stared at the blank space longer than necessary. I didn't know. I had never been told. I checked unknown and felt a quiet, irrational embarrassment, as if ignorance were a personal failing rather than an inherited one. When friends shared old photos online, I liked them without envy. Or so I claimed. But I noticed how easily they traced themselves backward. Baby photos, first steps, awkward haircuts. A visible continuum. A permission to remember. I didn't have that permission. When my mother visited me during my second year, she commented on how independent I'd become. "You've always been good at standing on your own," she said with pride. I smiled and accepted the compliment. What I didn't say was that independence hadn't been a choice. It had been the logical outcome of not being invited into certain conversations. Once, emboldened by distance and age, I asked her, carefully, if there were more photos from when I was little. I phrased it casually, as if it were an afterthought. She paused just long enough for me to notice. I don't know where they'd be now, she said. We lost a lot over the years. That was it. No elaboration, no apology, no offer to look. I nodded, changed the subject. Told myself I was being childish to care. That's the thing about rationalization. It makes compliance feel like maturity. Each time I swallowed a question, I framed it as empathy. I didn't want to burden my parents with nostalgia or regret. I didn't want to reopen chapters they'd clearly closed. I told myself I was being kind, and maybe I was. But kindness, when it only moves in one direction, starts to look like erasure. The pattern repeated in subtle ways. Decisions were made without consulting me. Information arrived late, or not at all. If I reacted with surprise, I was told, "We didn't think you'd mind." And I didn't. Or at least I didn't show it. I became skilled at not showing it. I learned that if you never object, people assume consent. They assume preference. They assume you are fine with being an afterthought. And once that assumption settles, it's hard to dislodge. The disrespect wasn't loud enough to confront. It didn't arrive as an insult or a boundary violation. It arrived as an omission, as a shared understanding that my curiosity was optional. So I normalized it. I absorbed it into my sense of self. I became someone who didn't need explanations, someone who didn't dwell, someone whose past was conveniently uncomplicated. But underneath that persona, something was accumulating. Not anger, not yet, just a growing awareness that my silence was doing work for other people, that my adaptability made things easier for everyone except me. The truth was hiding in plain sight, not in a single secret, but in the consistency of the avoidance. In the way every door led forward, never back. In the way my history had been edited down to what was comfortable to display. I didn't confront it then. I wasn't ready. Because confronting something means first admitting it exists. And at that stage, it still felt easier to believe that nothing had been taken from me than to consider the possibility that something essential had been quietly withheld. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to recognize the role I'd been playing. Not because it was forced on me loudly, but because it was rewarded subtly. I was the one people relied on. The one who showed up early, stayed late, remembered birthdays, and filled in gaps without being asked. In my family, I was described as the sensible one. In professional settings, I was low drama. These labels were offered as praise, and I accepted them as identity. The role came with expectations I never formally agreed to, but somehow upheld anyway. I didn't bring up uncomfortable topics. I didn't ask questions that might disrupt the mood. I didn't insist on being included in decisions that had already been made. I made myself useful enough to be indispensable, and quiet enough to be overlooked. In my family, this translated into a strange kind of trust. I was trusted not to react, trusted not to confront, trusted not to need reassurance. If plans changed, no one worried about how I'd feel. If information arrived late, it was assumed I'd understand. Matilda's flexible, they'd say, or she doesn't mind. And I didn't. Or rather, I trained myself not to. The realization came slowly, in pieces. I noticed that when my parents discussed the past, they spoke as if I'd entered the story halfway through, as if my life began at an age that was convenient to remember. There was no malice in it, just habit. At one point, my father referred to a difficult period as before things stabilized, then looked at me and said, "You were too young to remember all that anyway." I nodded automatically, but something in me registered the phrasing. Not we didn't tell you. You weren't there. You were too young to remember, too young to need to know. I began to see how that assumption had calcified over time. I was permanently positioned as the one who wouldn't ask follow-up questions. The one whose emotional bandwidth was assumed to be infinite, but whose informational needs were minimal. That's when I understood. My invisibility wasn't accidental. It was functional. It allowed everyone else to move forward without revisiting choices they might not want to explain. It allowed the family narrative to remain smooth, uninterrupted by context. And I had helped maintain it. Once I saw the role, I started noticing it everywhere. In meetings where my ideas were summarized by someone else. In friendships where I was the listener, rarely the subject. In the way people assumed my availability without confirming it. I had built a reputation on being agreeable. And the cost of that reputation was my own authorship. There was a quiet grief in that realization. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a sense of having misplaced something valuable without noticing when it slipped from my hands. I wasn't angry at my parents. Not yet. I could see how the role served them, how it reduced friction, how it allowed certain decisions to remain unexamined. But I began to question why my comfort had always been secondary to everyone else's ease. That question didn't demand immediate action. It just sat with me, patient and persistent. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my silence had been interpreted not as kindness, but as permission. And once you understand the role you've been assigned, you face a choice. Continue playing it, or quietly step out of frame. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't need to. The shift began internally, almost imperceptibly. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped smoothing over awkward moments. I started listening with intent, not to respond, but to understand. And in that listening, something else emerged. Not resentment, not a plan, just a growing awareness that my story had been edited by others for a very long time, and that I was the only one who could reclaim the right to read the uncut version. The day something shifted didn't arrive with an argument or a revelation. It arrived on an ordinary afternoon, in a place I'd been 100 times before. I was visiting my parents' house for the weekend, the same house they'd lived in for years. Familiar rooms, familiar routines. Nothing about the visit felt charged or important. At some point, my mother asked if I could help her look for a document. Insurance paperwork, she thought. Something she couldn't find. We moved through drawers and cabinets together, opening and closing them in practiced silence. Eventually, she went to answer a phone call, leaving me alone in the study. That's when I noticed the filing cabinet. It was old, metal, the kind that sticks slightly when you pull the drawer open. I'd seen it before, but never touched it. It was labeled in my father's handwriting, miscellaneous. The word caught my attention, not because it promised anything specific, but because it promised disorder. I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of habit. That familiar reflex to not intrude, to not cross lines that hadn't been clearly drawn, but were deeply understood. Then something quiet happened inside me. I realized I was an adult. I realized I wasn't asking for permission anymore, not because I was defiant, but because I no longer believed my curiosity was inappropriate. So I opened the drawer. Inside were folders, old ones. Some were labeled with addresses I didn't recognize. Some with dates that predated the version of my life I'd always been given. I didn't feel excited. I felt focused. I flipped through slowly, carefully, as if speed might distort meaning. There were bills, letters, and a few official documents, and then a thin envelope. Inside it was a photograph, just one. It showed a younger version of my parents, standing in front of a building I'd never seen. My mother was holding a toddler. The child's face was turned slightly away from the camera, but I recognized the curve of the cheek, the hairline. I sat down. There was no rush of emotion, no cinematic rush of memory, just a deep, settling clarity. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't loss or misplacement. This was curation. Someone had decided what parts of the past were accessible and which were not. Someone had chosen to remove this image from circulation, to file it under miscellaneous, rather than family. In that moment, I didn't feel betrayed. I felt awake. The shift wasn't toward anger. It was toward the agency. I returned everything exactly as I'd found it. Closed the drawer, straightened the folder edges, left no sign that I'd been there. When my mother returned, I handed her the document she'd been looking for. We chatted. We made tea. The afternoon continued, but I was no longer the same person who had entered that room. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider to my own history. I felt like an investigator. I understood something essential then. The past hadn't been hidden because it was harmful. It had been hidden because it complicated a story my parents preferred to tell themselves. And that understanding changed how I moved. I stopped needing explanations in the moment. I stopped needing reassurance. I stopped needing to confront, because confrontation seeks reaction. What I wanted was the truth. And truth, I had learned, doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits patiently, filed under a neutral label, trusting that eventually someone will be ready to look. That day, I didn't say a word, but internally, a decision had already been made. I would stop asking questions out loud. I would start answering them quietly. The day something shifted did not announce itself. There was no argument, no revelation delivered in a raised voice. No dramatic decision was made under pressure. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a place that felt appropriately unremarkable. I was working late at the institute, alone in the archival room. The building had that end-of-day stillness, the hum of fluorescent lights, the faint smell of paper and dust. I was cataloging a private donation, boxes of letters, receipts, and photographs from a family estate. My job was simple: identify, date, place, and sequence. I'd done this hundreds of times before. At some point, I realized how easily I could reconstruct lives from fragments. How a single receipt could anchor a year. How a photograph, even unlabeled, could be placed in time by the angle of light, the fashion of a sleeve, the condition of a wall behind it. I paused, because it struck me, quietly, almost politely, that I had never been allowed to do this with my own life. I had been told my past was lost, or unimportant, or inaccessible. Yet here I was, every day, proving that absence was rarely accidental. Those gaps usually existed because someone had decided not to fill them. I remember sitting back in my chair and letting that thought settle fully for the first time. Not as an accusation, as an observation. It wasn't rage that followed. It was clarity. I thought about the shoebox, about the deflected questions, about how often, too young, had been used as a permanent explanation, even as I aged far beyond childhood. And in that moment, something inside me realigned. I realized I had been waiting, patiently, subconsciously, for permission. For someone to say, "You're allowed to know now." For the door to be opened from the other side. That permission was never coming. Not because I was undeserving, but because my not knowing served a purpose. And once I understood that, the waiting stopped. I didn't feel betrayed. Betrayal implies expectation. What I felt was a quiet release from an unspoken contract I had never agreed to but had faithfully upheld. I stopped seeing myself as the passive recipient of partial truths. I started seeing myself as someone who had simply not exercised a right. That shift didn't make me reckless. It made me precise. I didn't go home and demand answers. I didn't call my parents. I didn't confront anyone. I went home and slept. The next morning I woke with a strange calm. Not determination. Calm. The kind that comes when you stop negotiating internally. Over the following weeks, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I asked fewer questions aloud, but I began answering them privately. I paid attention to dates, to inconsistencies, to the way certain years were consistently skipped in conversation. I realized that my family spoke about the past the way editors speak about early drafts, aware of what they'd cut, unwilling to revisit why. And for the first time, I understood that my role was no longer to preserve their narrative. It was to understand my own. That understanding didn't harden me. It softened something. It allowed me to see my parents as people who had made choices under pressure, perhaps fear. It allowed compassion, but not compliance. The shift wasn't loud enough for anyone else to notice, but it was irreversible. From that day on, silence stopped being something that happened to me. It became something I chose, and choice changes everything, because silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes a position, a vantage point, a way of observing without being observed. That afternoon in the archive didn't give me answers. It gave me orientation. I finally knew which direction I was facing, and once you know that, you don't rush. You move carefully. You move quietly. and you stop explaining yourself to people who never explain things to you. After that shift, my silence changed texture. On the surface, nothing about me seemed different. I still listened. I still showed up. I still spoke calmly, carefully. To anyone watching from the outside, I was the same Matilda I had always been. But internally, the function of my quiet had reversed. Before, silence was avoidance. Now it was selection. I no longer withheld questions because I was unsure I deserved answers. I withheld them because I was deciding when and where they belonged. This distinction mattered more than I expected. When I visited my parents, conversations unfolded as they always had. Familiar rhythms, familiar omissions. They spoke comfortably, assuming continuity, assuming my presence meant acceptance. And I let them, not out of fear, out of clarity. People often misunderstand restraint. They mistake it for passivity. They assume that if someone isn't pushing back, they aren't paying attention. That assumption is a luxury of the unobservant. I listened closely, not to the content of what was said, but to the structure, to the way timelines were smoothed, how certain years were described only in relation to external events, never personal ones, to how my own presence in those years was referenced vaguely, if at all. Once you start listening that way, patterns reveal themselves quickly. My parents never lied outright. That was the remarkable part. They didn't need to. They simply spoke around certain facts, trusting that I wouldn't interrupt the flow. And I didn't, because silence, when used intentionally, creates space. Space for others to reveal their assumptions. Space for inconsistencies to surface unchallenged. They assumed I still wasn't looking. In other areas of my life, the change was just as subtle. At work, I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. I let others sit with unfinished thoughts, with their own discomfort. I noticed how quickly people mistook my quiet for acquiescence. A colleague once summarized my project in a meeting without crediting me. I said nothing in the moment, not because I was afraid, but because I was taking note. Later, when documentation mattered, my name was already there. Calmly, permanently. That's the thing about quiet leverage. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. My parents, too, mistook my silence for continuity, for agreement, for the belief that whatever they'd decided years ago was still intact. They didn't notice that I had stopped sharing certain details of my life, that I answered questions more generally, that I redirected gently, the way they always had. I mirrored their methods, not to punish, but to understand them fully. And in doing so, I realized how much information flows toward the person who asks the fewest questions. People fill the silence, they justify, they explain themselves. All you have to do is let them. My parents began telling stories more freely around me, no longer guarding their phrasing as carefully. They assumed I had no interest in specifics, that I wouldn't retain them even if they slipped. They were wrong, but they had trained me well. I didn't write anything down yet. I didn't confront timelines. I didn't correct discrepancies. I observed. I let them underestimate me in the same way they always had, by assuming my quiet meant I wasn't building a framework behind it. What they didn't realize was that I was no longer seeking permission to know. I was preparing to understand. And understanding doesn't require confrontation. It requires patience. Silence, once reclaimed, becomes a kind of authority. Not over others, but over your own reactions. I didn't need them to confirm anything yet. I didn't need validation, because the more I watched, the clearer it became. Whatever had been withheld from me wasn't gone. It was simply being protected. From me. And protection, like silence, is never neutral. It always serves someone. I was just beginning to see who. What they never noticed was how methodical I'd become, because to them, nothing had changed. I was still the same daughter who didn't pry, the same presence at the table, nodding at familiar stories, asking about health, about work, about the safe parts of life. I never challenged the past, never interrupted the rhythm they'd perfected over decades, and that familiarity made them careless. What they didn't see was that I had stopped experiencing conversations emotionally and started experiencing them structurally. I wasn't listening for reassurance anymore. I was listening for the sequence. Dates, places, cause and effect. At the Institute, I handled records every day. Documents people assumed were meaningless on their own. I knew how easily a life could be reconstructed if you stopped looking for a single dramatic truth and instead mapped small, consistent details. So I applied the same discipline to myself. I began with what was public and uncontroversial: birth records, address histories, school enrollment dates, moves that were mentioned casually but never anchored in time. I didn't need permission for any of it. This wasn't an intrusion. It was verification. What surprised me wasn't that information existed. It was how little effort it took to find it once I started looking calmly. I created a private timeline. Nothing elaborate. Just dates and sources. No conclusions. No interpretations. I resisted the urge to speculate. I'd learned that speculation creates noise. Facts, on the other hand, create gravity. I noticed gaps immediately. Years where addresses changed unusually often. Periods where records existed, but didn't align with the stories I'd been told. Small discrepancies that wouldn't alarm anyone unless they were placed side by side. I didn't confront those discrepancies. I contextualized them. At family dinners, I asked neutral questions, not about why, but about when. Questions that sounded like curiosity, not a challenge. Oh, was that before or after we moved? How old was I then? Was that the year you started the new job? They answered easily, confidently, and sometimes differently. That's what people underestimate about quiet people. We remember how things are said, not just what is said. We notice when a date slides, when a sequence shifts depending on the audience. Each answer became a data point. I never corrected them. Correction would have closed the flow. I needed it open. I began cross-referencing casually mentioned events with external records. Employment changes, property listings, travel records. Nothing invasive, nothing illegal, just publicly accessible information viewed through a patient lens. What emerged wasn't a scandal. It was a pattern of careful omission. Certain years were treated like narrative dead zones. A transition no one wanted to linger on. A before and after structure where I was consistently positioned after. I also noticed something else, something quieter. The way my parents spoke about those years wasn't defensive. It was rehearsed, not scripted exactly, more like muscle memory. Phrases repeated over time until they no longer felt like choices. That told me something important. Whatever had happened wasn't being hidden impulsively. It had been managed, and management implies intention. I began documenting everything, not emotionally, but archivally. Notes dated and sourced. Direct quotes are marked as such. No interpretation added. I treated my own life with the same professional detachment I offered strangers' histories. That detachment protected me, because once you see your past as a record rather than a wound, you stop bleeding into it. What they never noticed was how often they filled the silence for me. How, when I stopped reacting, they elaborated, clarified, adjusted. Silence invites explanation. An explanation reveals priorities. I didn't rush. There was no urgency. I wasn't trying to catch them in anything. I was trying to understand the shape of the truth they had chosen to present, and the shape of what lay outside it. By the time I felt ready to draw even tentative conclusions, months had passed, and I felt steady, not triumphant, not angry, just positioned. Because preparation isn't about plotting an outcome. It's about removing uncertainty. And uncertainty, I had learned, was the only thing that ever made me hesitate. Now I wasn't hesitating. I was simply waiting for the moment when understanding would no longer be partial, when the last missing piece would shift from absence to clarity. And I knew, without impatience, that moment was coming. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. That surprised me most. There was no spike of adrenaline, no cinematic moment where everything suddenly rearranged itself. Instead, there was a quiet click, like the final piece of a puzzle settling into place after you've already understood the picture. I was alone when it happened, appropriately so. It began with a document I almost didn't request, because it felt unnecessary. A formality. One of those records that rarely changes anything on its own. I had no expectation attached to it. That's important. Expectation distorts perception. When it arrived, I read it once without reaction, then again, slower. And then I placed it beside the timeline I'd been building for months. The alignment was unmistakable. The truth was hiding in plain sight, not as a secret buried deep, but as a detail that only mattered if you cared enough to connect it to everything else. What I discovered wasn't a betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was a decision, a deliberate one, made at a time when my parents believed they were protecting stability, perhaps even protecting me. But protection, I realized, is often indistinguishable from control when the person being protected is never allowed to outgrow it. The document confirmed something I had suspected but never named: that a critical part of my early life had been reframed so thoroughly that it ceased to belong to me. Legal choices had been made, records adjusted, narratives simplified, not erased, curated. I sat with that word for a long time. Curation implies care. It also implies exclusion. And suddenly, everything made sense. The missing photos, the reluctance, the rehearsed explanations, the assumption that I would never need to know, because by the time I was old enough to ask, the story would already be settled. What struck me most was not what they'd done, but how calmly they'd lived with it afterward. They weren't haunted. They weren't defensive. They had moved on, convinced that silence had solved the problem permanently. They had mistaken my compliance for closure. I didn't feel rage. I felt distance. The kind of distance that comes when you finally see a situation clearly enough to stop personalizing it. This wasn't about me being unworthy of the truth. It was about them believing they could manage it indefinitely. And now, I held something they didn't realize I had. Not just knowledge, but context. Leverage is an uncomfortable word. It suggests aggression, manipulation, intent to harm. But real leverage is quieter than that. It's simply the state of no longer being dependent on someone else's version of reality. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not a friend, not a colleague, not my parents. I didn't even react emotionally right away. I updated my timeline, added sources, marked confirmations, and then I closed the folder. That was it. No confrontation, no tears, no late-night spiraling. Because once the truth is clear, drama becomes unnecessary. I understood now why the photos were withheld. Why were certain years were never revisited? Why was I treated as someone who had arrived after the hard parts, even though I hadn't? I also understood something else, something subtle, but crucial. They believed this truth, if revealed, would destabilize something. The family, their self-image, the version of events they'd learned to live with. But I wasn't interested in destabilizing anything. I was interested in sovereignty. I didn't need to expose them. I didn't need to correct anyone publicly. I didn't need acknowledgement to validate what I knew, because the most powerful shift had already happened. I no longer needed them to explain my past to me. The leverage wasn't the document itself. It was the clarity it gave me. From that moment on, every interaction changed. Not externally, but in weight. I understood what was at stake for them, and what was no longer at stake for me. They still thought the silence protected them. They didn't realize it had set me free. Once you know the truth, you're faced with a moment people rarely talk about. Not the moment of discovery, but the moment after, when you realize nothing is forcing you to act. There were many paths available to me then. I could have confronted my parents immediately, laid the documents on the table, and demanded explanations. I could have asked why they thought I didn't deserve the full version of my own life. I could have asked who else knew. How long did they plan to keep the story sealed? I imagined that version briefly. Not with anger, but with curiosity. I could see how it would unfold. The initial shock, the defensive justifications, the careful framing of intent. I could already hear the phrases, "We did what we thought was best. You were too young. We didn't want to confuse you." They would mean it, and that was the problem. Another option was silence in the old sense. I could have closed the folder, told myself that knowing was enough, and continued as before, letting the information sit unused, unacknowledged. I could have treated it like a private artifact, something interesting but inert. But that too would have been a choice, and not a neutral one, because silence, when it preserves a false balance, isn't restraint. It's participation. There was also a more dramatic route: exposure, correcting the record, insisting on public acknowledgement. But that path required a desire I didn't have: the need to be believed. I already believed in myself. So I slowed down and asked a different question. Not, what do I want them to feel? But what do I want my life to look like once this is no longer unresolved? The answer surprised me in its simplicity. I wanted autonomy. Not distance, not punishment. Autonomy. I wanted my decisions to no longer be influenced, subtly or otherwise, by a narrative that wasn't mine. I wanted to move through the world without carrying an invisible edit made by someone else. That ruled out confrontation. Confrontation would have centered them, their explanations, their emotions, their need for resolution. I wasn't interested in that. The irreversible choice I made was quieter and far more final. I decided to stop orienting my life around their version of events. That may sound abstract, but it wasn't. It meant I would no longer seek emotional alignment with people who had denied me informational alignment. It meant I would stop protecting their comfort at the expense of my clarity. It meant that future decisions about where I lived, what I pursued, how much access they had to my inner life, would be made without accounting for a story that required my silence to function. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't need to. But once made, it changed the shape of everything that followed. I began disentangling quietly, not cutting off contact, just loosening the assumptions. I shared less, explained less, sought less approval. I stopped pre-editing my reactions to maintain equilibrium. They noticed something eventually, but not immediately. The shift was too subtle to alarm them. They interpreted it as maturity, independence, the natural distancing of adulthood. They had no idea it was something else entirely. I wasn't pulling away. I was stepping out of a structure I had never agreed to inhabit. And that decision, once made, could not be reversed. Because even if I had wanted to go back to the way things were, I couldn't unknow what I knew. I couldn't re-enter a dynamic that depended on my ignorance. The truth didn't demand action, but it demanded alignment. And I chose alignment with myself. That was the moment the future quietly reoriented. Not with a declaration, not with conflict, but with a decision so private, so grounded, that no one else could argue with it, because they didn't even know it had been made. Once the decision was made, action didn't feel dramatic. It felt procedural. That too surprised me. I had expected movement to feel charged, emotional, maybe even risky. Instead, it felt like finally following instructions that had been waiting patiently for years. I began by addressing the practical areas of my life that had always been influenced, quietly, by family gravity. Finances first. I reviewed accounts, beneficiaries, and informal arrangements that had been set up long ago and never revisited. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was malicious. But many things were assumed. Assumptions, I'd learned, are simply decisions no one remembers making. I adjusted them. I consolidated, clarified, ensured that anything tied to my future required only my consent. No explanations, no announcements, just structure. Then came legal boundaries. Not dramatic ones, no ultimatums, no exclusions, just precision. Updated documents, clear directives. The kind of preparation people put off because it feels uncomfortable, not because it's unnecessary. I handled it calmly, methodically, as if I were preparing an archive for someone else. At work, I made choices I'd been deferring for years. Projects I'd hesitated to pursue because they might require relocation. Opportunities I'd quietly declined because they didn't align with unspoken expectations about proximity and availability. I stopped factoring those expectations in. When an offer came that would shift my schedule and my visibility, I accepted it without asking anyone how they felt about it. No one objected. They didn't see it as a rupture. They saw it as progress. That was the irony. I wasn't rebelling, I was reorganizing. My parents still believed they understood my trajectory. They assumed my choices fit within the familiar outline of who I'd always been. And in some ways, they were right. I was still calm, still considerate, still restrained. What they didn't realize was that restraint no longer meant accommodation. I answered calls. I visited. I listened, but I stopped offering emotional labor automatically. I let silences sit. I didn't rush to reassure or explain. They didn't notice at first. Most people don't notice when access narrows gradually. They noticed outcomes, not process. I moved apartments, changed routines, built a life that was legible to me first. And all the while, the information I held remained unspoken, untested, untangled from reaction. Because leverage doesn't need to be exercised to be effective. It just needs to exist. I didn't threaten. I didn't hint. I didn't elude. I simply stopped living as if the past were something I had to tiptoe around. And that had consequences, though not immediate ones. The world responded differently to me when I stopped anticipating discomfort that wasn't mine. Decisions became cleaner. Relationships clarified themselves. Some deepened. Some drifted. That was fine. What mattered was that I was no longer orienting myself around a narrative gap. I had filled it. Privately. Permanently. My parents still believed the silence protected them. They didn't yet understand that silence, once reclaimed, doesn't just hide truth. It reshapes power. And I was moving with the steadiness they had never associated with change, because they still mistook quiet for stasis. They had no idea the ground was already shifting beneath the familiar story they stood on. The consequences didn't arrive as a confrontation. They arrived as an absence. Not the dramatic kind. No slammed doors. No declarations of distance. Just small, accumulating changes that were difficult to name, but impossible to ignore once felt. My parents noticed it first in ways they couldn't articulate. I wasn't as available. Not unreachable, just not automatically present. I returned calls, but not immediately. I visited, but less predictably. I listened, but without the familiar urgency to fix, soothe, or affirm. They interpreted this as adulthood, as busyness, as the natural evolution of a child who had grown into her own life. But something about it unsettled them, because what they were losing wasn't my presence. It was my compliance. And compliance, once withdrawn, leaves a vacuum that people don't know how to fill. They began to repeat themselves more in conversation, as if clarity might restore the old rhythm. They offered unsolicited updates, asked questions they'd never asked before, not about the past, but about my future. Are you happy where you are? Do you see yourself staying there long term? You know you can always come back, right? I answered honestly, but briefly. Yes, I'm not sure, I know. What they felt, but couldn't yet name, was a loss of access, no information, to influence. They had been accustomed to a version of me that adjusted herself in anticipation of their expectations. That version was gone. At work, the shift produced clearer results. Projects I'd quietly supported were now visibly mine. When decisions were made, I was consulted differently. Not because I demanded it, but because I no longer absorbed ambiguity on behalf of others. People respond quickly when you stop carrying what isn't yours. In my personal life, some relationships deepened. Others faded. Friends who valued mutuality adjusted easily. Those who relied on my listening more than my voice drifted away. That was instructive, but it was with my parents that the consequences became most pronounced. They began to sense a change they couldn't correct without naming it. And naming it would require acknowledging something they had avoided for years. So instead, they circled it. My mother once said, "You seem different lately." Not accusing, observational. I smiled. Different how? She hesitated. More settled, but also farther away. I let that sit. She didn't press. She rarely did. What she didn't realize was that the distance she felt had nothing to do with geography or time. It was structural. I had removed myself from a dynamic that required me to be partially uninformed. And without that dynamic, the balance shifted. They felt it in subtle ways. In how conversations ended sooner. In how advice landed without effect. In how their reassurances no longer shaped my decisions. They began to worry, not about me, but about their relevance. And that worry expressed itself as confusion. They asked gentle questions that went nowhere. They offered help I didn't need. They reminisced, carefully, about safe periods of my childhood, as if anchoring us there might restore something. It didn't, because what they had lost wasn't nostalgia. It was authority over the narrative. And authority, once surrendered without ceremony, is almost impossible to reclaim. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. I could see how the system had functioned, how my silence had stabilized it, and how its removal, even without explanation, created strain. They didn't know why things felt off, but they felt it. And they didn't yet understand that the absence they were experiencing wasn't temporary. It was the natural result of a truth no longer being managed on their terms. There's a moment, in any long-avoided reckoning, when people realize something essential has shifted, and that whatever tools they used to rely on no longer work. For my parents, that moment arrived quietly, but unmistakably. It wasn't a single event. It was an accumulation of failed corrections. They tried warmth first, more frequent calls, invitations framed as nostalgia. "We haven't done this in years," my mother would say, as if recreating the past might restore the present. I went. I was kind. I didn't resist. But I didn't re-enter. Then they tried reassurance. My father reminded me, unprompted, that everything they'd ever done was for my good. That phrase had once closed every door gently. This time it landed differently. I didn't argue. I didn't contradict him. I simply acknowledged it and moved on. That's when confusion set in, because reassurance only works when someone is still seeking it. They sensed the shift then, not as rebellion, but as something more unsettling. Independence without negotiation. My mother asked once, carefully, "Did we do something wrong?" The question hung in the air between us. I could have answered it in many ways. I could have opened the folder. I could have named dates. I could have finally said, "You never let me see my own history." But the truth is, by then it was too late for that kind of repair. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because repair requires a shared timeline of reality. And ours had already diverged. I said, honestly, "I don't think you did what you did to hurt me." It was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. They waited for more. I didn't add it. That was the moment panic entered the room. Not loud panic, not tears or raised voices. Just the dawning realization that something crucial was no longer accessible to them. They began to offer explanations no one had asked for, revisiting old decisions abstractly, framing them as unavoidable, necessary, protective. I listened, calmly, but the explanation, offered too late, doesn't restore trust. It only reveals how long someone hoped silence would hold. They asked if I was angry. I wasn't. Anger would have meant I was still waiting for something from them. What they were sensing wasn't resentment. It was finality. They had believed, perhaps unconsciously, that if the truth ever surfaced, it would surface through them. On their terms. In a moment, they could manage. They hadn't accounted for the possibility that I might already know, or that knowing might change nothing outwardly, and everything internally. My father grew quieter. My mother is more careful. They watched me in a way they hadn't before, as if looking for signs they'd missed. But what they'd missed wasn't emotional. It was temporal. The moment for fixing it, the moment when a simple acknowledgement could have reopened the story, had passed years ago. Not because I'd hardened, but because I'd matured. And maturity doesn't wait indefinitely for permission. There was regret then. Not fully spoken, but present. In the way my mother lingered on sentences. In the way my father avoided certain phrases he'd once used freely. They were trying to adjust without naming the adjustment. Trying to repair without admitting what had been broken. And that's when I understood something essential. They weren't afraid of losing me. They were afraid of losing the version of themselves that had never been questioned. And that loss, once felt, cannot be undone. Because it doesn't live in argument. It lives in awareness. And awareness, once shared unevenly, cannot be unlearned. By the time they realized something needed to be addressed, there was nothing left to fix in the way they understood fixing. The silence they'd relied on for years no longer protected them. It only reflected back what had always been there. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no dramatic unveiling of documents spread across a table. It occurred on an afternoon that looked, from the outside, exactly like any other visit. Tea is cooling between us. The quiet hum of the house. Familiar chairs. My mother was the one who spoke first. "I feel like there's something you're not telling us," she said. Not accusing. Tired. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she was asking not out of guilt, but out of uncertainty. The old methods weren't working anymore, and she didn't know what had replaced them. So I answered her carefully. There are things I know now that I didn't know before, I said. That was it. The room changed. Not with tension, but with attention. My father asked, about what? About my early life. They exchanged a glance. Not panic. Recognition. I didn't explain how I knew. I didn't need to. The fact that I knew it all was enough to shift the balance. My mother's first instinct was to justify, to frame, to protect the intention. We were trying to keep things simple, she said. We thought it was kinder. I nodded. I understand why you made the choices you made, I said. And I meant it. Understanding doesn't require agreement. My father asked quietly, Are you angry? No, I said, I'm clear. That word landed heavier than any accusation. Because clarity doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It just exists. They waited for more. For emotion. For confrontation. For something they could respond to. But there was nothing else to add. I didn't ask why they hadn't told me. I didn't ask who else knew. Those questions belonged to an earlier version of me. One who needed their answers to move forward. I no longer did. I'm not bringing this up to revisit the past, I said. I just want you to understand why some things are different now. My mother nodded slowly. She looked relieved, wounded, and thoughtful all at once. What's different? She asked. My boundaries, I said. That was the closest thing to a line I drew. Not as punishment, as a definition. There was a pause. Then my father said, We didn't realize. I know, I replied gently. That's part of it. There was no apology offered, not directly. But there was something else. Something quieter. A relinquishing. They understood then that I wasn't seeking validation, that I wasn't opening a negotiation, that the story they'd curated no longer defined the terms of our relationship. And because there was no heat, there was no fight. Just a recalibration. They didn't ask to see what I'd found. They didn't ask for details. Perhaps because asking would have meant acknowledging how thoroughly the past had been managed. Perhaps because they already knew enough. When I left that day, nothing felt resolved in the conventional sense. There was no catharsis, no forgiveness scene, no final closure. But there was equilibrium. Not the old kind, built on silence, but a new one, built on awareness. They knew I knew. I knew they understood that. And that was sufficient. Sometimes confrontation isn't about speaking loudly. Sometimes it's about refusing to perform the role that kept everyone else comfortable. And walking away without needing the last word. Who I am now is not defined by what was hidden from me. That's important to say. For a while, I worried that uncovering the truth would reshape me around loss. That I would become someone oriented by resentment, or suspicion, or the need to constantly correct the record. But that didn't happen. What happened was quieter. I became someone who no longer needs permission to stand fully inside her own life. The past didn't disappear once it was acknowledged. It integrated. It took its proper place, not as a wound to be tended endlessly, but as context. Information that belongs to me, and therefore no longer has power over me. My relationship with my parents is different now. Not colder, just clearer. We speak honestly about the present. We don't pretend the past needs to be explained retroactively. There are things we still don't discuss, not because they're forbidden, but because they no longer carry urgency. Silence now is mutual rather than imposed. And that difference matters. I no longer try to be the version of myself that requires the least maintenance. I don't preemptively smooth conversations or absorb discomfort that isn't mine. I don't volunteer to be invisible in order to preserve harmony. What surprised me most was how little bitterness I felt once I stopped expecting my parents to become different people. They made decisions with the tools they had at the time. I don't excuse those decisions, but I understand them. Understanding has allowed me to step out of the role of the injured party without denying the injury. There's a quiet dignity in that. In my own life, the change has been profound and almost mundane at the same time. I chose where I live without explaining it as a compromise. I pursue work that aligns with my curiosity, not my usefulness. I let people see me clearly, or not at all. I no longer confuse being easy to love with being easy to overlook. And perhaps most importantly, I trust myself. I trust my memory. I trust my perception. I trust my right to know what shaped me. That trust has become the foundation of how I move through the world. When people ask me now about my past, I answer plainly. Not defensively. Not dramatically. Just honestly. I don't over-explain. I don't protect anyone's narrative. Not because I want to expose anything, but because I no longer need to hide. The story that once felt incomplete no longer does. Not because it was rewritten, but because it was reclaimed. I am still calm, still reflective, still quiet in many ways. But my quiet now is anchored. It comes from choice, not habit. From clarity, not accommodation. And that has changed how people relate to me. They listen differently. They ask differently. Some step closer. Some step back. Both reactions tell me what I need to know. I don't carry this story as a burden. I carry it as proof. Proof that understanding doesn't require confrontation. That dominance doesn't require force. That the most lasting shifts often happen without anyone else realizing when they began. I am not the child who waits anymore. I am the woman who knows. And that knowledge has given me a kind of steadiness no one can take away. When I look back now, the most surprising thing isn't what was hidden from me. It's how quietly everything changed once I stopped waiting to be told the truth. For a long time, I believed closure was something other people gave you. An explanation. An apology. A moment where the past was finally named out loud and placed neatly where it belonged. But that isn't how it worked for me. Closure didn't arrive as a conversation. It arrived as a decision. The decision to stop orienting my life around what others were comfortable revealing. The decision to treat my own history as something I had the right to understand fully, without translation. The decision to value clarity over harmony when the harmony depended on my silence. What I learned is this. Silence is never empty. It always serves someone. For years, my silence served stability. It kept things smooth. It allowed people I loved to move forward without revisiting choices they had already justified to themselves. And because I was quiet, adaptable, and patient, it was easy to believe that silence was mutual. It wasn't. Once I reclaimed it, once I chose silence instead of inheriting it, it stopped being a limitation and became a boundary. And boundaries don't need to be loud to be effective. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't correct the family narrative publicly. I didn't demand recognition for what I'd been denied. I simply stopped living inside a story that required me to remain partially uninformed. That was enough. The truth was hiding in plain sight the entire time. Not in a single secret, but in a pattern. In the things that were always redirected. In the photos that never appeared. In the years that were spoken about vaguely, if at all. And once I saw that pattern clearly, I no longer needed to dismantle it. I stepped out of it. If there's a moral here, it's not about parents, or secrets, or even photographs. It's about authorship. About the moment you realize that understanding your own life is not an act of disloyalty. That asking quiet questions, especially of yourself, is not a betrayal of love. That maturity sometimes means accepting that people can care for you deeply and still make choices that limit you, and that you are allowed to outgrow those limits without turning anyone into a villain. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about no longer negotiating your reality. Today, my life feels whole, not because the past was repaired, but because it was acknowledged, integrated, returned to me. I don't carry bitterness. I carry perspective. And perspective, I've learned, is what allows you to move forward without dragging the past behind you. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt that parts of your own history were kept just out of reach, I want to leave you with one gentle question. Have you ever realized that something important in your life wasn't taken from you, but quietly withheld? And what did you do once you understood that? I'd really like to hear your thoughts.